Philippi wasn't a town which had grown naturally. Its position on a major overland trade route made it an attractive prestige site to a succession of rulers. The first to go for it was Philip of Macedon, the father of Alexander the Great. He took an insignificant village and turned it into a declaration of his own greatness. Philippi means of Philip. I should say, by the way, that when I was taught Latin I would have pronounced this Philippi, but for the purposes of our study here I'll stick to the more usual pronunciation and tell my Latin background to just go and hide for the moment. In later years, two Roman regimes rebuilt and extended the place, modifying its name by attaching the name of the appropriate Roman emperor to it, but the Philippi bit remained, and it continued to be what most people called the city. The Romans also gave it the status of a colony, which meant that it had a significant military garrison, and its style of government aped that of Rome. So it was an important town, even a town used to proclaiming its own importance. Although it was in Greek, or was it Macedonia, they were arguing about that already in those days, its Roman status meant that the official language of the city was Latin, but Greek was the lingua franca for the whole of the eastern half of the Roman Empire, so there was no difficulty in Paul's communicating with them in Greek, either in his letter or during his visits. Archaeology and surviving documents show that there was a very wide selection of religions in Philippi. Just about anything you could find in Rome, in Thrace, in Macedonia or Greece was represented there. Also on the subject of religions, the Jewish presence in Philippi was very much smaller than in other places where Paul ministered. Let's move to Acts 16. For a start, the first 10 verses. In Paul's second missionary journey, he revisits those places where he'd worked in the south of Turkey. And then he sets out to explore fresh ground in the north, but the Lord expressly tells him not to. The positive counterpart to that negative instruction was a call to go over the water into Macedonia. So his route took him to Troas, Troy of the classic stories, and that was still on the east of the Aegean Sea, then by sea over to Neapolis, and then Philippi. And if you follow this on a map, you'll then notice that Thessalonica is an obvious follow-on from there. Paul's usual habit had been to begin in a new place with the local synagogue. It looks as if the Jewish community in Philippi was too small to have its own building. So on the Sabbath, Paul made for a spot by the river which was known to be a place of prayer, and there he found a group of women. It was, of course, a surprise to find no men there. Now, if he'd found a synagogue, not only would he have expected to have found men and women there, but they would have very likely been of three kinds: Jews, God-fearers, and proselytes. God-fearers were those Gentiles who joined in synagogue worship. Proselytes were those who went the extra step of being baptized, and the men circumcised, so that they belonged in a sense that God-fearers didn't. It seems that in Gentile cities, the God-fearers and proselytes often made up a significant proportion of those in synagogue services, and it also seems that a high proportion of the converts that Paul won in synagogues were also either God-fearers or proselytes. But back to the women by the river. One of them was a God-fearer who was known as Lydia. That was probably not her proper name, because it was where she came from. Thyatira is in the region called Lydia. This Lydia was a ready convert to Paul's gospel. She was also quite well off, and invited Paul and the others in his team to stay in her house. She also then hosted meetings in her house. Quite a useful start to Paul's work in Philippi. Well, the story in Acts makes sense if there was quite a lapse before the incident in verse 16, because it needs the cause in Philippi to have got well underway first. But let's turn to look at verses 16 to 24 in Acts 16. This incident itself, it says, took place over many days, with the slave girl involved repeatedly making a nuisance of herself. Paul was convinced that her powers of fortune-telling were down to an evil spirit, so eventually he was so fed up with her harassing that he commanded the spirit to leave her, which it did. His diagnosis was clearly correct because she promptly lost her ability to tell fortunes, and therefore lost her ability to earn money for her owner, who was furious. Well, the girl and her fortune-telling would have fitted very happily into the religious atmosphere in Philippi, where there was such a variety of religions that it was a case of anything goes. But here were these strangers who were messing that up. What's more, these strangers were Jews as far as the townspeople could tell, so resentment of their intrusion had an extra bite to it. A mob then seized Paul and Silas and took them to the appropriate authorities, demanding that they be charged with unlawful religious practices. Well, as the mob grew and grew more angry, the magistrates had to act on those demands, and they had the apostles stripped, flogged, and thrown in prison. We move to the remainder of chapter 16, verses 25 onwards, where it becomes clear that the drama was not yet over. At midnight, an earthquake severely damaged the prison, including the stocks in which Paul and Silas were bound, making it possible for them to stand up and leave. The jailer, fearing that he'd pay for his life for letting his prisoners go, was about to kill himself, supposedly the honourable way out. But he discovered that his prisoners were still there, and that changed everything. He knew they represented some strange religion that he hadn't come across before, but now, sensing that there had to be something special about men who wouldn't make a run for freedom, he felt impelled to let them lead him into their religion, and Paul duly delivered his spiel to the jailer and his family, and they all became believers. In the morning, the magistrates sent word that the prisoners were to be released. "Not so quick," said Paul. "You had us flogged without troubling yourselves to find out that we were Roman citizens for whom flogging is illegal." That made the magistrates realize that they were in deep trouble, and thinking that Paul and Silas were definitely bad news for them, they pleaded with them to leave Philippi. Imagine being the webmaster of the new church in Philippi, having that story to put on your church website about how the church had begun. Wonderful. A more boring version of the story is to say that the church in Philippi was the first church that Paul founded in anything that can claim to be Europe, assuming that is that you don't count Turkey as in Europe. Let's leave Acts and start thinking about the letter. Paul's letter was clearly written from prison, it says so, and the most obvious imprisonment was his final time in Rome. But you could possibly find some quite respectable writing on Philippians that claims it was written during Paul's early imprisonment in Caesarea, or even earlier than that, while he was imprisoned in Ephesus. Don't dismiss anyone who says these things. Don't dismiss them on these grounds. I don't agree with their conclusion, but it could be that the rest of what they have to say about the letter could be perfectly okay. It is then distinctly possible that Philippians was Paul's last letter to be written to a church. If it is, then the fact that it's so full of joy is a wonderful testimony to Paul's spiritual condition just before he was martyred. Now, no one seriously doubts that this letter was written by Paul. Even the most extreme of the Scissors and Paste Brigade don't raise any such doubts. and it is a very personal letter, which throughout arises from Paul's pastoral relationship with that church. Some do wonder, though, in a purely technical way, whether it was written as a single letter or as two or three which have been joined together for inclusion into the New Testament. But that sort of point is only really of interest to those who are trying to make a detailed reconstruction of where Paul was at what moment of his life. It makes hardly any difference to the rest of us, so I can't work up any enthusiasm for pursuing the point. But back just for a moment again to Acts 16. There's an awkward bit of interpreting to do in verse 31, where Paul speaks of salvation coming to you and your household. Does that mean that you and your household should all put your faith in Jesus, resulting in the salvation of all of you? Or does that mean that if the jailer puts his faith in Jesus, then he and his whole household will be saved? The first of those possibilities seems obvious to us because so much of our thinking is based on individuals. But in those days, a lot of thinking was corporate rather than individual, and it would have made a lot of sense to people then to say that if the head of the household was converted, then the whole household automatically would take on a new identity defined by the head's new faith. So it's quite possible that what Paul and Silas meant was on the assumption that for the moment only the jailer would profess his faith in Jesus. Nevertheless, the eternal destiny of the entire household would change as a result. And it's on that little teaser that we conclude our first foray into Philippians. In the second part of our looking at Philippians, we're scanning the content of the first two chapters. Let's start then at chapter 1, verse 1. And the greeting in this verse contains three words which have moved on a very great deal since Paul wrote. So let's look at the three of them. The first is the word hagioi, which is often translated saints, although it doesn't here, of course, mean people who have been canonized by the Roman Church, just the people whose lives are holy to the Lord, and that means the members of the church in Philippi. The second word is episkopoi, probably translated in your Bible as overseers. That's a literal translation. Epi is it means over, and skopoi is related to our word scope. So it's a word which looks for them to have responsibility over a particular area. But in more recent situations, this word has been translated very often as bishops. You see, in later years, this word was used for the regional leader of the church, even down to the idea that the more local ministry was carried out in that leader's stead by vice leaders or vicars. There's nothing of that here, of course. The episkopoi here are simply those in the local congregation charged with leadership, very probably the same people who might elsewhere be described as the presbyteroi, the elders. The third word, diakonoi, almost universally rendered deacons, but sometimes you might find it translated as servers. Our best assumption is that these were like the 7 appointed in Acts 6, men appointed to carry out duties which relieved the leaders of a certain amount of routine work. Catholics and Anglicans, of course, would love to read this verse as sowing the seed for their threefold ministry of bishops, priests and deacons. But there's no mention of priests here, and the bishops bit is irrelevant to that Catholic interpretation. Let's move on to verse 2. This verse has another sign that things we take for granted were nothing like as developed when Paul wrote. What you would expect in this sort of greetings formula would be fully Trinitarian, mentioning Father, Son and Holy Spirit. Now, Paul had as much to say about the Holy Spirit as anyone, but in Paul we're a long way off the full doctrine of the Trinity. In later years that doctrine was used as a test of who was a Christian and who wasn't, and indeed the Trinitarian creeds were largely written precisely for that purpose. And indeed it remains a useful flag today. If someone has a Trinitarian belief, then they're one of us in a sense. But it wouldn't have occurred to Paul that he ought to make a properly Trinitarian statement at this point. He could do it. Witness the way he closes the second letter to the Corinthians. But it wasn't for him a point of honour to make sure to do it in the way that it became eventually. Now let's look at verses 3 to 11 in chapter 1. I fancy as I read this passage that I can hear the words of someone who knows he will never see the Philippians again, and he's commending them to the Lord. At several points he wants to make sure that they know how dearly he's prized his relationship with them. In verse 6, although he's not himself in a position to take them any further, he's confident that the Lord will. And in verses 9 to 11 we have a prayer which echoes the prayers that he wrote in Ephesians, and which conveys something not only in speaking to the Lord, but conveys something to the people listening as well, or reading his letter, something along the lines of, if you want some final indication from me as to the direction I'd like you to take, then this is what I'm here praying for. It's also a mark of his regard for the Philippians that he's not laying down specific regulations which they must be sure to follow. Instead, he's able to take some fundamental ideas like love and later joy and reinforce them. In business and in politics, a leader who's unsure of his followers will not only lay down the goals, but will also specify many of the precise objectives. One who's more able to trust his subordinates will ensure that they've got the right grasp of the goals, and then leave it to their good sense to frame objectives where appropriate. And that's what Paul is doing here. He trusts the Philippians. And then verses 12 to 15. After Paul's experience in prison in Philippi itself, it should be no surprise to find him putting a positive construction on his being in prison whilst writing this letter. You'll remember that when Jesus was crucified, it became clear to the centurion in charge of the execution that the man they were executing was someone outstanding. It seems that the quality of what there was in Paul's life was similarly becoming evident to the soldiers running his imprisonment in Rome, assuming that's where he was. And then verses 15 to 18, Paul's life is being made distinctly worse by Christian preachers who let it be known that there must be something wrong about Paul. It must be that their preaching in that way arises out of jealousy and ambition. But Paul is so single-minded in his work for the Lord that he's even glad that those people are preaching. In a world which desperately needs to hear about the Lord, what does it matter if Paul's name gets blackened a bit in the process? He rejoices that they're preaching Jesus. And then verses 18 to 26. Paul manages to persuade himself that whatever happens to him, he's better off. If he's allowed to live through this present crisis, he'll be glad to be still alive, and he'll be again available to minister to people like the Philippians. But if he is killed, he'll be more directly with the Lord, and indeed his very death will in itself be a witness for the Lord. Verses 24 to 26 make it look as if he'd persuaded himself that their continuing need for his ministry meant that the Lord would preserve him. But as the overall picture makes it look as if this was written from Rome and that he was soon martyred after that, it would seem that Paul was mistaken on that point. In the last few verses of the chapter, whatever happens to him, whatever happens to the Philippians, they have an opportunity to witness through the godly quality of their lives. Don't miss out on a chance to witness, folks. And so into chapter 2. I want to look at verses 6 to 11 first. Paul's letters are obviously written in prose, but this section comes across as some sort of verse. And the obvious possibility is that he's quoting here a poem or a hymn about Jesus which existed before the letter was written. There's no indication as to whether the hymn had been composed by Paul or by someone else, and no indication as to whether the people reading this letter will have come across the hymn before. But this passage shares with a few others the idea that the Son of God existed before Jesus was born in Bethlehem. So in Bethlehem, it would be fair to say that he was foregoing his status and his glory and becoming man. The graphic image in which Paul pictures this here is of the eternal Son of God emptying himself, leaving behind his glory and the most obvious marks of his status in order to fulfill his commission on earth. And the Greek notion that Paul is using for this emptying here is the word kenosis. In itself that's not particularly important, but I mention it because you might possibly find someone referring to the Lord's action here as kenotic, which is just trying to get that word into an English adjective. You won't lose much if you manage to stay clear of people who talk in such out-of-the-way language as that, but there it is. Anyway, Paul studiously avoids saying that the Son of God entered into a human body as if he was some sort of ghost who could for a while inhabit a human body. Paul was thoroughly Hebrew in his thinking, and the Hebrew view always has been that spirit, soul and body formed a unity, a person. There could be no question of an outside spirit taking up residence in a body belonging to someone else, unless of course it was an evil spirit whose arrival amounted to an invasion. So the hymn here has to speak instead of the Son of God becoming man. This means that when later the hymn speaks of Jesus having human form, it cannot mean that he was a divine being who only appeared to be human. The story of the incarnation is not of the Son of God only seeming to be human. That was the heresy of Docetism, which was both influential and damaging some decades after Paul. The New Testament story, though, is of the Son of God becoming human, not play-acting so that it looked as if he was human. Verse 10, every knee shall bow. My understanding is that this isn't going to happen within the present world order. For so long as people have the free will to choose or to reject Jesus, significant numbers are going to reject him. For so long as bowing to Jesus is a matter of your faith, some are going to be unbelievers. They see no necessity to give any allegiance to Jesus. So if every knee is going to bow, the conditions under which we live will have to change. And I believe that this is the time when the new heavens and the new earth are made, as in the beginning of Revelation 21. And it might be what the Lord was referring to in Luke 8, at the time when, as the time when the things that are hidden will be revealed. In the present world order, spiritual things are hidden, while material things are visible. No spiritual things are grasped by spiritual things are grasped by faith rather than directly by knowledge. In the new world order, Spiritual things will be as plain and as obvious as material things are now. You won't need faith to see that Jesus is the Lord of Lords. It will be totally obvious to everyone. And that, I believe, is why that at that stage every knee will bow to him. Some only too pleased for their Lord to be seen by everyone. Others now forced to recognize him and presumably plead for mercy in the light of a lifetime of ignoring him or even of opposing him. Let's now go back to the 5 verses that we missed out at the beginning of chapter 2. Just notice why Paul introduced that hymn. He was talking about the qualities of lifestyle and character that Christians should seek to foster in themselves, and his instinct is to refer to Jesus as the model. At every opportunity, again we find, Paul centers his thinking around Jesus. Move then to after the hymn there to verses 12 and 13. Paul tells them to work out their salvation with fear and trembling. Well, of course, that only makes sense on the assumption that their salvation is something which is not yet complete. And the fear and trembling bit makes it sound as if it's appropriate to entertain some measure of fear that you might still mess up big time and end up not being saved. Now, a lot of our evangelical preaching is based around the assurance that salvation is something you're freely given and then you possess it. We're even used to being told that we ought to experience a real certainty that we are already saved. We even expect to know that sort of certainty from the very day that we make our life over to Jesus. Where does that certainty come from? Well, both Jesus and Paul clearly mention salvation as something which has already happened to us. Luke 19 verses 9 and 10, an important part of the work of Jesus had already happened in Zacchaeus. Salvation had come to his house. It was now a reality in his life. Or several places in Paul, look at Romans 8:24 for instance. Paul refers to our being saved in the past tense. It's something that has already happened. So what's Paul doing in Philippians here, referring to our salvation as still in process? Clearly what's happening is that Paul senses that there is something about our standing in the household of God which we need to preserve with the greatest of care, and he decides to describe it with the word salvation, without for a moment cancelling the other ways in which he uses the same word elsewhere. Take this, if you like, as a measure of the richness that Paul discerns in the idea of salvation, something that you can be sure to possess right now, and yet something which will become so much more glorious and which won't quite be complete until the very end of time. That's where we conclude our second episode on Philippians. So our third episode is looking at the contents of chapters 3 and 4. Chapter 3, verses 1 to 11. There was clearly a group in Philippi who were trying to persuade Gentile converts that they had to be circumcised as Jews before they could be counted as proper Christians, sticking, that is, to the idea that the church could only ever be a Jewish sect. It's typical of Paul that when he encounters their contribution and counters it, he presents an argument on much wider grounds than just saying, oh no, you don't have to be circumcised. He reiterated the conclusion, at least, of the justification argument that he'd presented in Galatians and Romans. I mean, Philippians isn't a big, heavy letter like Romans, but the substance of that teaching is here. Paul begins by seeming to play the justification by works game with his opponents, pointing out that, according to the rules of that game, he personally would score more points than most other people. But then he insists on taking that game onto a level you can never reach with justification by works points, the level which is only reachable by putting your faith in Jesus, the level on which the strategy is to be joined with him now in both defeats and victories, the level on which the prize is to join him in his resurrection. And Paul's game plan is to abandon, in a sense, level 1 altogether, even though he seemed to be winning it, and to go straight to this top level with Jesus. Chapter 3, verse 12, through to the first verse of chapter 4. Just because he's playing on the top level, Paul doesn't want people to think that he has an inflated idea of his own importance. Remember, he's not on this level because of his own attainment, but because of the grace of God in Jesus, giving him something he doesn't deserve. His attention then must be on staying faithful to Jesus so as not to forfeit the privilege of being on the top level. Verse 20 seems to me to be particularly poignant if it's true that Philippians is Paul's last letter to a church before his martyrdom. By the same grace as allows us to play on the top level, we already have our hands on the prize, though perhaps in the sense of touching it rather than of totally possessing it. But the nearer we get to possessing it, the more real and alluring it seems. Chapter 4, verses 4 to 9. Paul is already tasting the delights of heaven. His relationship with the Philippians is such that he finds it easy to encourage them to share this with him. And his language soars into heavenly heights to express this. He calls them to entrust all their concerns to the Lord in prayer, and to keep cleaning up their lifestyle. And in both efforts, he expects the peace of God to be with them in a powerful way. In verses 10 to 20, getting towards the end of the letter, you'd expect here to find principally some personal greetings. But again, Paul scales the heights of both thought and language. Verse 13 is often misquoted. The all things that Paul refers to here is his ability to keep joyful in a time of deprivation. That's a much less macho scene than the ones to which this verse is often applied. In its context in this letter, this verse is not really about venturing all sorts of wonderful things for the Lord. It's more about putting up with all the nasty things that come one's way. Verse 19, too, has a flavour which is not always proclaimed when the verse is quoted. It's spoken here to people who are spending themselves and their money for the sake of Paul, and he's convinced that the Lord will honour their faithfulness. Just as our forgiving each other makes it easier for the Lord to forgive us, so our being generous to others makes it easier for the Lord to be generous to us. I'm unhappy with this verse being used to support some sort of prosperity gospel. Well, as we've just seen these two verses, which so often get taken out of context, this will be a good point to reflect a little on hermeneutics. That's just a long word for the theory lying behind the way that we interpret the Bible. I suppose that the first thing to note is that we probably do interpret the Bible on the basis of some sort of theory, but may well be unaware of what theory it is. It's probably better for us to be aware of it. So here goes. Let's say first that we should assume that the point of interpreting the Bible is to help us hear the word that God is addressing to us today, which may be an us in the sense that God has a word to address to us as a group or as a church, the same word addressed to all of us, or it could be that he addresses more individualized words to each of us. In both cases, the issues are much the same. Well, there are lots of different theories as to how we should go about interpreting the Bible, but the two verses that we've just seen readily remind me of two obvious theories. And the first one is that to hear what the Lord is saying to us today through a particular passage, we should start with trying to see what that passage meant originally, what it meant in the mind of the writer, what it likely meant to its first readers. And that means that we have to learn all sorts of information about the language and culture at the time it was written, and that we then study the passage in its original context. We then have a judgment to make about how that meaning might transfer into our language, into our culture, into our setting today. There are lots of points in that process where the result may be by no means obvious, but on this approach it's a process that we need to have a shot at. The other possible approach is that we completely ignore that process and jump straight to what we think the words mean to us today. That may be because we're ignorant of the original setting, either because information about it just isn't available to us, or because we don't recognize that learning about the original setting is something we should be doing. It is, of course, quite possible to be gloriously unaware that we do live in one particular culture and that other people have different cultural assumptions, or, as in the days of the British Empire, that other people would be better off if they adopted all of our assumptions. The first LP record that I ever bought was Handel's Water Music and Fireworks Music in an arrangement for full orchestra by Sir Hamilton Harty, a composer and conductor of a century or so back. He clearly thought that in order to perform this music in public, he needed to arrange it for a full Victorian symphony orchestra so that it ended up sounding more like Brahms than Handel. Well, these days more people are willing to find out what Handel probably meant it to sound like, and then decide how to perform it. The fireworks music, for instance, Handel wrote to accompany a fireworks display which was out of doors, and he didn't want to commit a string band there, so he based everything around a band of oboes. Harty decided that if Handel had lived more recently, he would have used a proper orchestra, and that's what Harty arranged it for. He turned the overture into a civilized piece of indoor music. In this course, I think it's fairly obvious that I've been working on the first of these methods, trying to illuminate passages for you by exploring their origins and then moving from there to what the passage might mean to us today. And that means I'm probably going to be a little bit rude about people taking the second approach. I'll label the second approach as that appropriate to the Harry Potter Book of Spells, but not to the Bible. People find a particular form of words in the Bible. They assume that that's what what those words mean to them is precisely what were meant by their author, and therefore what it must be that the Lord means for us to take as his word to us today. There have even been people who select a passage at random and invest it with meaning in that way. Some of them have even closed their eyes, flicked through the pages and stuck a pin in the page in order to find out what God is saying to them on that day. Well, that approach might do for the Harry Potter spellbook, in which what people need to find is a particular form of words which are supposed to do the business in a situation they face. But the Bible simply is not a compendium of magic sayings. It's much, much richer than that. For instance, if you want to find the meaning for you of something that Jesus said, you don't just need to find out what he said. God's word revealed to us in the is partly in the sort of person that Jesus was, in the things that happened to him, even in the way that his first followers started finding out how to be Jesus people. All of that is involved in the transmission to us of God's word through Jesus. So we need to find out all we can about Jesus, about what he did, about what happened to him, even about the culture and historical setting in which he operated. And only then should we start to become confident about the meaning of some of the things he said. And it's even more complicated than that, because all the records we have of Jesus and his ministry were written by particular followers of his. So we need to learn all we can about those authors and their ministries, so that we can stand a chance of spotting whatever spin they each put on their writing. And that should increase the confidence with which we can take a picture of Jesus from what they write. Now, of course, all that is so complicated that no one of us will ever reach the point of having got so good at it that we needn't learn to do it anymore. I mean, if you thought that that you didn't learn to need any more about reading the Bible in that way, you wouldn't be studying this course. If I thought it, I would have dashed off my prep for this course much more quickly and easily than I have done. A last comment on this issue, but in terms of the Philippian letter. If I'm reading something that Paul wrote to these people, I'm really curious to know what Paul thought he meant to say to them before I try working out what it says to me. And the turbo version of that is that if I'm reading about something that Jesus said, I definitely think it's worth putting a lot of effort into exploring what he might have meant by it, rather than jump straight into what those words seem to mean to the likes of us today. Just one last little bit of Philippians. Would you read, please, chapter 4, verse 23. And just imagine that this verse is the very last thing that Paul ever says to you. Goose pimples or what? The theology of Philippians. Two comments about what this letter implies for us. The first is that Philippians is a good place to be reminded to appreciate what Jesus gave up and what he went through in order to win our freedom. Chapter 2 in particular uses the notion of his self-emptying. We don't know whether Paul composed the poem in that chapter himself or whether he was quoting someone else, but the poem introduces this self-emptying, this kenosis, as a new way of expressing admiration for what Jesus did in obedience to the Father. We should let it awaken our own admiration of Jesus. And the other comment is that Paul was so at ease with the Philippian Christians that it's a good reminder for us to appreciate fellowship with those with whom we can get on well. And I suppose it's also a reminder to us to learn to cope with those times where our fellow Christians are not as easy to live with. Both of these are done in honour of what Jesus coped with in order to bring us our salvation. Bless you.